Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening for our panel discussion on long COVID. My name is Karma Lowe, and I'm the Senior Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, Enrollment, and Community Engagement at the Columbia School of Social Work. We really appreciate you joining us for this important panel. I'm going to turn this over to our moderator, Terri Wilder, an MSW, who's an adjunct lecturer at the Columbia School of Social Work. She was diagnosed with myalgic, and I'm not going to pronounce this correctly. Terri, can you help me, please?
Yes, it's myalgic encephalomyelitis. It's a mouthful.
Okay, and chronic fatigue syndrome in March 2016. Since her diagnosis, she has worked with elected officials, public health departments, healthcare providers, journalists, and activists to raise awareness about CFS, and long COVID across the globe. Terri is currently a consultant and volunteer with hashtag #MEAction and leads the Minnesota hashtag #MEAction chapter. She was instrumental in passing a piece of legislation in New York State that provides for an ME/CFS education and outreach program, and represented hashtag #MEAction on the Federal Chronic Fatigue Syndrome Advisory Committee. She uses the skills she learned from the AIDS movement and the LGBTQ+ community to fight for the ME/CFS and long COVID community. Terri is a 1992 graduate of the University of Georgia School of Social Work, where she earned her MSW, and she also graduated from UGA with a bachelor's in social work. I now turn it over to Terri.
Thank you, Dean Lowe. Thank you so much. I always feel like after that last sentence, I should say go dogs, but I don't want to get plummeted by Columbia alumni, so I won't say that. Like Dean Lowe said, I'm Terri Wilder. I'm an adjunct professor at the Columbia School of Social Work. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a white woman wearing a black shirt. I wear black glasses, and I have brown hair and brown eyes. And I'm thrilled to moderate our discussion this evening. Tonight, I'll be talking to 4 of the authors of the Long COVID Survival Guide, which is a recently published book that has been described as, and I'm going to quote here, the first patient-to-patient guide for people living with long COVID, with expert advice on getting diagnosed, dealing with symptoms, accessing resources and accommodations, and more. So this evening, in our time together, we're going to explore some topics like bias in healthcare, chronic disease, disability and identity, and reproductive and sexual health, among others. And of course, these are all important topics in social work practice. Many of us will have careers in healthcare related organizations. And I think this conversation is going to be very applicable no matter where you go after you graduate from Columbia. I did a quick Google last night, and as of May 2021, there were 22,000 social workers working in healthcare in New York State. And in another document I looked at, they shared that there will be a 17% increase in growth across the country in healthcare social workers by 2028. So many of the topics we're going to talk about tonight are going to be applicable to your practice, probably no matter where you work, but particularly if you have an interest in your social work practice working in health-related settings. So I've asked each author to read from their chapter for about 2 minutes. And after the authors read a little bit from their chapter, I'll pose some questions, and then we'll have some discussion and opportunity for questions from the audience. But before we get started, I just want to make sure that you know that you can put your questions in the Q&A. If you have very specific questions for a particular panelist, it would be helpful if you would actually just put their name and your question so I know who to direct it to. Finally, we will announce the winners of our book drawing for one of the Long COVID Survival Guide books. Folks will be notified after our program, hopefully in the next week. So I'd like to begin by briefly introducing our panelists. And you should have received their fuller bios via the announcement for this event. But like I said, I'll do some brief intros before each person shares from their chapter. So I'm going to ask my friend Pato Hebert to go first. He is an artist, teacher, and organizer. He is a COVID long hauler, living with the impacts of the coronavirus and publicly addressing the pandemic since March of 2020. His lingering solo exhibition about long hauling debuted in 2022. He serves as chair and an associate professor of arts in the Department of Art and Public Policy at NYU's Tisch School of Arts. So Pato, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Terry, and thank you, Dean Lowe. And I just have to say, it's such an honor to be here in deep COVID community and with these fierce women of color. I'm really very, very thrilled. My quick excerpt from the chapter, which is titled COVID Can't Be Outpaced, Learning Radical Rest and Pacing. I've been sick since March 2020. One of the most important yet difficult things for me to learn and practice has been pacing. Proceeding with daily activities when I have the energy to do so, resting when the energy isn't there, and planning and adjusting my days with this rhythm in mind. This is an ongoing challenge due to my own ableist ideas about effort and worth, and because of the different paces at which my long-hauling symptoms have appeared, ebbed, reemerged, and confounded. Even writing this essay and meeting my deadlines has been a challenge. COVID likes romping around and enjoying itself all over our long-hauling bodily systems. It ain't fun. I've had to learn that recalibration is more important than rigid notions of recuperation. I have had to recalibrate my habits and my expectations, my ways of being. I've had to learn to pace. I haven't always understood the rhythms of pacing and its vital importance for long haulers. So for guidance, I turn to the wisdom of other warriors with chronic illness and the work of ME Action, an advocacy group and global movement for health justice. I learned about ME Action through the dynamic organizing that's happening between communities of ME, COVID, HIV, and disability activists. Even though our more coordinated efforts are still in the early years of gaining momentum and shared traction, we're not mutually exclusive communities. People living with chronic illness compare notes on gaslighting, stigma, workplace or dating challenges, strategies for advocacy, and policy changes. I have tools for grappling with long hauling, and I'm blessed because I've been shaped by organizing, learning, and playing with other people. I'm the political progeny of decades of HIV organizing, primarily with queer communities of color. This work has taught me about harm reduction and dueling, sex positivity, and strengths-based approaches to community and to care. It's also blessed me by bringing countless amazing, resilient, brilliant, courageous, irreverent activists, organizers, and everyday folk into my life. Some of these people are also living with ME and/or other chronic illnesses and disabilities. The ME community knows all about fatigue and pacing, gaslighting by healthcare providers and loved ones alike, and the urgent need for high-quality research, treatment, resources, and mobilization. This aligned understanding of our daily survival skills, community building, and strategies is invaluable, as is their call to, quote, tell those with long COVID to stop, rest, pace, end quote. And since I first learned of this campaign, I've been trying to enact its guiding wisdom in my daily life. Thanks, Terry.
Thank you, Pato. I would next like to introduce Chimére Smith, who I lovingly refer to as my work wife. But I will give her a more formal introduction in saying that Chimére is a writer and a thought leader who has appeared frequently in the press, including Time, The Washington Post, The New York Times, Stat News, and Wired UK. She has been consistently coined as a, quote, passionate, patient-led advocate after attracting the attention of local politicians, doctors, and hospital administration to receive life-saving care as she battled COVID-19. In April 2022, Chimére accepted a volunteer engagement consultant position with ME Action and became my work wife.
Thank you so much. I want to just say thank you to Karma again for this. We're living in a day where there are certain politicians who are literally, as we speak tonight or this evening for some of us, who are trying to eradicate and erase diversity and inclusion and how we engage with each other. They don't want what we have and what we see today on this screen and in our form. So I'm so thankful for another opportunity to show the likes of those politicians and show those people who are championing for us to not be in these kinds of spaces, how electric we are when we are. So thank you once again, and thank you, Terri, for that beautiful introduction. I'm also going to preface this by also saying that in the chapter that I wrote, I talked a lot about how pervasive it is for a Black woman not to have a need, because society has taught us that it's almost shameful not to need. And then I'm going to switch over to talk about when I actually had to admit that I had a need. So if it seems a little confusing, I'd like to just explain that. I didn't need anyone for shit. I'm a Black woman. The word need simply didn't exist in my vocabulary. Black women want, desire, crave, seek, shift, survive, and accomplish. But we often make it our mission to never, ever need a motherfucker for anything. The world teaches us this crucial lesson from birth. We learn it the first time we learn it the first time parents disappoint or leave us, the moment our hearts are shattered after that first heartbreak, the very first time we are fed poisonous rhetoric about why a white person got the call, the job, or opportunity instead of us, when we are better qualified. It is emblazoned in our minds and hearts so clearly. We do whatever possible to assure ourselves that needing people is like shit, a substance that only belongs in the toilet to be flushed. All I knew was I just wanted mom. I wanted to be where I knew she was, even if we couldn't be in the same room. I wanted to be in my room downstairs, listening to her animated voice, talking loudly on a phone call, or her beautiful crooning of any gospel song that crept into her mind. She made me feel safe. Even if she didn't know what to do, she always just knew what to do. Hoping that mom was too tired to come downstairs to greet me as she usually did, I weakly unlocked the door to our home. If I had what I suspected but didn't dare say aloud, I couldn't risk her contracting it too. Mom was in her early 60s, a leader at a church, a mother, a grandmother, and a great-grandmother of two handsome young boys. She was a mover and a shaker, putting to shame women half her age. I would have rather died than expose her, so I made sure to wear my mask as I hurried downstairs to my room. Lead and steel were lighter than my body that first week. Sleep never came so easily. I didn't crave water or food. I just drowned in the sea that was my bed, begging for relief from what had surely come to kill me. At night, the darkness greeted me with snaring panic attacks that made me race around the basement, praying to God that whatever was chasing me would stop. Naked and drenched in sweat, I ran myself into a dizzying puddle on my bed, where sleep would lock me into her grip again, threatening to make my stay permanent. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chimére. Our next panelist is Karla Monterroso. Did I say your last name correctly?
You did.
I did. Oh, thank you. Fantastic. So Karla is the founder and managing partner of Bravo Leaders, where she is a coach, strategist, and advisor for several organizations and people doing work impacted by the changing dynamics of the demographic shift. She supports both their ability to distribute power strategically and contend with bridging the new divide between the social experience and institutional experience of power. and working on the eradication of anti-Blackness and non-Black Latinx people through coaching, culture, and strategy. Karla.
Hi, everyone. My efforts to get healthy happened in the background while my whole world was being severely impacted by this disease. Over the course of the pandemic, I had 37 friends and family members get sick. 17 loved ones have ended up in the hospital. 2 have died. It was like I got hit by a train, then had to scream warnings from the train tracks because I couldn't yet get myself up from them. I was often the first person people came to with questions because I'd been one of the first to get sick. So I created an onboarding guide to do emotional labor that I was no longer able to do. This onboarding guide has been used by family, friends, and strangers alike. It has advice for the acute phase of the disease and what you do as you transition into being a long hauler. According to Pew Research Center, 52% of Latinx people in the United States know someone who was either hospitalized or died from COVID. We account for 29% of COVID cases, even though we are only 18% of the population. I felt those conditions in my multi-generational and multi-class family. When my grandmother passed away from COVID in December of 2020, her second bout with the disease, it took months before I felt her death as anything other than my failing her. Failing to get to my family before disinformation, failing to help them understand the severity of my condition, and failing to ensure she was protected from a world very much in denial about COVID's repercussions. There's a weird tension between knowing that you were systematically failed by your country and knowing how lucky you were to escape with your life. For my medical, financial, and emotional needs, I found cheerleaders and systems in my community to help me, even when I faced the mountain of challenges that are constant in the lives of people of color in America. There was an equal and opposing force trying to save me. I have family and friends who made every effort to ensure that I was fed, cared for, and defended. They have the resources to do so. I also know that I am an exception. Most people in my community don't have my luxuries. We are facing a disability crisis that is having and will continue to have a disproportionate impact on Latinx and non-Latinx Black and Native people. And there is no indication our country is preparing itself for this crisis. We need to put governmental and nonprofit systems between people of color and the discrimination we're facing. In their absence, we need to set up community structures that support us. By creating these systems, we greatly increase the odds that all long COVID patients get the resources and support they need. Yet here we are, more than 2 years, now more than 3, into this pandemic, and not a single systemic intervention outside of vaccines has been made. The American project is poised, yet again, to send the message that our lives are disposable if they are not of use to the economy.
Thank you, Karla. And finally, I'd like to introduce and welcome Monique Jackson. Monique is an artist and trustee of Charity Long COVID Support. Monique became unwell with a suspected infection of COVID-19 in March 2020 and experienced long-term symptoms thereafter. Monique created the Still Ill Corona Diary, an online graphic journal illustrating her experiences with long COVID since July of 2020. Monique.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you everyone for today. It's pretty powerful listening so far. Okay, so the chapter I did was not the only one talking about menstrual changes. I spoke with a few different people who discussed and reflected on the changes they felt in their bodies. And what I will read is a conversation I had online with Boris Gay via a call out on my social media is how I discovered them. I wanted to speak with a non-binary person who had experiences of long COVID related menstrual changes. And so I'll read it here. Boris said, I've been seeing a gynecologist who recommended that I go back on the contraceptive pill I used to take, which stopped my periods entirely. I took it for years. I had the occasional spotting on it, but it never made me bleed. Since I restarted it post-COVID, I've bled almost every single day. I have huge, heavy bleeds with clots in them. There's something about physically viewing periods people don't want to deal with, images of blood. Even doctors and nurses don't want to look at them. I don't know if it's like a super British thing. I've been taking photos. I ended up sending them to a friend of mine saying, I hope you don't mind me sending this to you, but what's your take on this? They're also a non-binary friend who has had bad problems with periods. They were like, I've had clots like that before, but if it's not normal for you, you should keep telling people about this. So I said, I guess I haven't had many people to compare my blood clots with, and I've been hesitant to document my periods or do research. I wonder how much that relates to growing up in a culture where TV commercials showed menstrual blood as blue liquid instead of its natural color. How do we make this conversation easier for us as people who have experienced changes to our menstruation cycles after COVID? So that's what I've read. And there are illustrations in the book. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Monique. I'm going to start with you, and I purposely put you last so I could start the conversation with you. I teach a human sexuality class here at the Columbia Graduate School of Social Work, and I always include a class on periods because nobody ever wants to talk about it. So thank you so much for including this topic in the book. I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about why is sexual and reproductive health an important topic to be covered under disability and chronic disease?
So what comes to mind when I sort of started to reflect on what am I going to do for this was that it was a subject that I really struggled with in so many different ways. To identify in myself, to visualize the language. I was literally lost for words, and visually as well. I was terrified, actually. It brought out big emotional responses in me. How do I draw this? Like, and I was immediately thinking of what I can't do first before even thinking. It was like a panic. It brought out such a panic in me. I thought, okay, this needs to be, I need to have conversations about this because, so the reason I'm sort of just sharing that process is because with my lived experience of noticing these changes, and I would consider myself somebody pretty open. Like, I don't think I have a lot of shame about my body or sexuality. But I thought, God, even for me, I was having difficulty talking about it. And I thought, this is an area that needs more representation, visibility. And I just didn't see the need. I think I'm just concerned about this being overlooked. And I know in my own experience, having this condition, it's well known how many kinds of symptoms. Unfortunately, I did start to create a hierarchy, and I kept putting it back as something, this isn't a priority to talk about. And I'm concerned that that's not just me. I'm from the conversations I had with others in this chapter that seems to be a common experience. And I'm very curious to hear if anyone else has any other opinions, because I thought I'd just begin there, if that resonates at all.
I am so glad that you brought this up, Monique, because it is a topic that's still almost, 3 years later, is grossly underrepresented and not talked about. And I think it's because of the fear and the trauma that comes with it. Our bodies can do wonderful and magical things. And when how our bodies reproduce changes or because we are mostly visual people, human beings most of the time, right? It can be terrifying. I remember not being able to leave my room because I couldn't hardly make it to the bathroom back and forth. I had to crawl on my hands and knees sometimes. And I just, TMI, for those who, but I know this is a grown folk conversation. I was so scared because the clotting was so bad. It was almost like, and I hate to say this, like if someone had gotten shot or gotten punctured somewhere, and that I was afraid of that. But when I mentioned it to doctors in that same hierarchical way, they were like, oh, that's not as important. And I was just like, no, this is important. So I talked to my OBGYN about it. And he was just saying, yes, he had actually been treating patients because he was also concerned about fibrosis as a result of the inflammation and things like that were happening. So I'm so glad you mentioned it, because that's something that we have to talk about, for people who identify as women, and people who still get menstrual cycles but don't identify as female or women. It's important for them to know as well that this is a thing, because if you don't, you might have a cycle one month and you might be like, oh my goodness, what's going, am I going to die? And you just don't know, because it's not well documented. And it's not talked about enough. So thank you for acknowledging that. And I certainly concur with what you said.
Thanks, Chimére. Karla, did you have something you wanted to share?
Yeah, I mean, my clots were slow big. My period was essentially a solid, right? And every single time that I had my period, it would kick up an inflammatory flare. So I would be doing okay. And then the moment that my period came, it was like 2 weeks of recovery to try and get back to baseline every single time, both with chronic fatigue, brain fog, and the pain that I'd been getting in my calves, abdomen, and chest. And I ended up getting the Nexplanon insert because it was a progestin. It was like progestin based, so it's not hormonal in nature, because the hormones within birth control can produce a risk of clotting, right? And so, but I had, I'd gone through 7 different primary care doctors before I got to the point where anyone even recommended that. And specifically paid for a women's clinic to go to in order to recommend that, because no one wants to hear about it or talk about it, including the medical professionals that we are interacting with.
Thank you all for sharing that. And I'm just hoping that, for the social work students that are here with this evening, really thinking about this is important when we think about taking histories, biopsychosocial assessment, to make sure that we're including sexual health, reproductive health questions in those assessments. Because if you don't see this on a list or it's not getting attention, we may be the only ones to ask. Monique, did you want to say something?
Yes, please. Just to add as well, thank you. I've just seen in the chat just about about 20% more likely to experience erectile dysfunction. Mm-hmm. To say thank you, Pato. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. That essentially with this chapter that I've done, I hope it's sort of more like it's a springboard into such a broad area of that. So it's only, I think, a small insight into something quite specific. And I hope that there are other areas that can be with people with lived experience can share about within, because there's so many other areas relating to people with different types of bodies and how it's affected. So I just wanted to make that clear. This is specifically obviously menstruation, but there are other areas which
thank you. Yeah, and Pato, thank you so much for putting that information in the chat. I don't know if you want to actually say it out loud and share a little bit more about that.
Well, I just want to shout out Monique's work because I've been a fan since as earliest I came across, and I think, Monique, your candor and your vulnerability, but also your fierceness and resilience that comes through, and the way you presence the body, and a body that's ill and unsure but also discovering, is really, really powerful. And to answer your question, or address your question, Terri, I think why it's so important for us to be talking about our bodies and how COVID changes our bodies and how we know our bodies is because people with chronic illness and disability are often rendered invisible by systems, and, you know, as Karla's piece talks about, and we're denied our sexuality and the possibility of pleasure. We're denied the cycles of our body and how our bodies become different rhythms and need different things. And there's nothing deficient about us, but we have new different experiences that we want to understand, and that we want to care for ourselves and each other and the people we love. And so I think that's why it's so important that sexual and reproductive health, and also just the rhythm of the body, is front and center in how we address things. It's not just about pills or pathologies, you know, it's about the vibrancy of our lives. And I think Monique's work reminds us that every single post she made, and that body of work that you've built and given the world, Monique.
Thank you, Pato. So Pato, I actually have a official question for you, actually from your chapter. And I know that this may be familiar to some of the social work students or the social work faculty. But in your chapter, you talked about Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris and how she said that COVID, and I'm going to quote what you put in there, that COVID is, quote, probably the greatest collective trauma of our generation. And I'm just would love to hear why you included that quote in your chapter. And what do you think social workers should remember, and remember this, why should they remember this particular quote when working with people with long COVID?
Yeah, I mean, for context, Dr. Burke was the first state surgeon general in the state of California ever. Fierce Black woman who's long done work around structural violence and inequity, especially as it impacts Black and brown young people, kids, and how to dismantle those systems and build systems of care. And she says this, Terri, in the context of leaving, stepping down from that job after 3 years. And I thought very different from, but maybe as an echo of Jacinda Ardern, who just stepped down from being Prime Minister in New Zealand, like women modeling, right? That people do not need to be superheroes. Give what we can and then pace and adjust accordingly. And so I think in stepping down from her position to continue her life's work, but also focus on her well-being and her people's well-being, her family's well-being, she was modeling something really very important against kind of capitalism's notion that our worth is only what we do in terms of work and productivity. And I think what she was signaling with that particular quote is that, for all I just said about the body and COVID, it's also really impacting us emotionally, socially, structurally. And I think what she was signaling is that even if the virus's impact on the body seems to shift over time because we get better medicine or because we have an overhaul of our healthcare system, we've got a lot of mental health work to do, and a lot of work to do around sexism, racism, transphobia, poverty. Who has access to what we need? And we should all have access is the answer. That shouldn't even be a question. But of course we know it is. And I think her work really modeled, in the heat of a pandemic, against a lot of racist and sexist resistance that she met every day with her team trying to do the work, that even doing the work can be traumatizing. And certainly the impact of the pandemic will be with us for a long time. We shouldn't race to put it behind us, but should instead recognize the toll that it's taken and will keep taking, and then we should respond accordingly. And I'm very grateful to her and her team for doing that work, because we so want to compartmentalize and reduce things, as everybody's been saying, and not deal with it, a whole ecology in the ways that we need to. So I'll leave it there, Terri, because I know you have other questions.
Thank you. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe that she also is the person that did a lot of research around the ACEs, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. So has a long history of looking at trauma. And, you know, one of the things that we talk a lot about in schools of social work is providing trauma-informed care. And sometimes it ends up being a buzzword. But I think we have to put it into context of what people are going through and really thinking about that and what it means to help people feel the safest that they can possibly feel when they're getting services. And it's important to understand the context of what they may have gone through. So Chimére, I wanted to ask you, one of the things that I noticed as I, have read many of the chapters, and of course the beauty of this book is you don't have to sit down and read it from page 1 to the end. You can jump around because of these beautiful chapters that are kind of go together, but kind of stand on their own. One of the things that I noticed that, many of the artists, and I consider you all artists because you are writers and artists and in the sense of painting and drawing, but many of you talked about ableism. If you didn't name it, you definitely described it. And this constant narrative that is kind of forced on people that you're not valued if you aren't working or contributing to society in some way. And I'm wondering if you can talk, you hinted at it a little bit when you were kind of sharing your part of your chapter, but can you talk about kind of your inner thoughts and feelings around kind of ableism and that shame that you may have been experiencing and your kind of reluctancy to like want to ask for help and actually accept help when you were really, really struggling at kind of the height of your symptoms?
Yeah, absolutely. I love what Pato said about recognizing his own ableism as he started to investigate his body's and along with Emmy Action's guidance on resting and pacing, because what this condition has taught me is how much of an ableist I was. Now, as a Black woman, had someone said that to me and said, oh, you have an ableist, privileged mindset, mentality, and lifestyle, I'd have been like, hold up, no, that's not true, because, it can't be true. But that's not true, because even how I looked at disability was so ableist. It was, even I think about my former students who had individual education plans, IEPs and 504s, behavioral plans, and I would judge them so harshly. And as I think about them now, I oftentimes think to myself, in all honesty, I did some of those students a disservice. Now, towards the end of my career, I finally was reading and researching and was creating lesson plans that were pertinent to all learners in my classroom. But before that, I was just like, I don't know why such and such is acting like that, or that's such an ableist mentality. And so I think even in that ableism, as a Black woman, culturally and in-house, I have been taught. I mean, I'm talking about from great aunties to grandmothers to aunties to my mama to my godmama, who I talk so much about, who the chapter is dedicated to. I talk about these are women who, I'm telling you, they would rather, I'm telling you, they would rather do the thing they hate to do the most than aside from asking for help, than to ask for help. I've watched my godmother bake 50 pies. She loves baking sweet potato pies, and she won't ask you to help her do nothing, because for her, asking for help means that she's not contributing 100%. And so I've always considered myself to be an open person, but it wasn't until I got very, very sick that I realized, in my shame of being sick, because there's a shame attached to it that we don't even, it takes a long, I'm still unpacking that shame, right? As I still grieve on some days, not being a teacher, contributing to society the way I thought was appropriate for a Black woman to do, right? And so, I withheld my illness from my family for 4 months, partly because DC and Baltimore is about an hour and 10 minutes away. So I didn't have to worry about, in a pandemic, anybody showing up at my door. People were calling and they were texting, but there was, we were trying to keep our distance. So nobody was showing up saying, hey. But it wasn't until July when I was hospitalized and I was in that room by myself. And I had to say to myself, I need help. And I cried in that hospital bed. The nurses were so concerned. Why are you crying? They called the behavioral health specialist because they were worried. But I was just like, the tears were my grief of having to actually text and call my family members to say, I need you, because I hadn't been taught to do that. I went from being a struggling makeup artist, a pretty good one, right, who needed my family's help every couple of months paying bills, to an award-winning teacher with a health insurance card, students who loved me, making good money, bills were paid, to go to a sick person with no money in the bank, no I lost vision in my left eye. I just could not fathom telling my family that. And so I was shrouded with guilt. It took me, and it's still taking me time with my therapist to unpack it, because culturally Black women don't need. But that is and as I wrap up, that is I'm hoping that when people read this book and my chapter, and I talk about the cracking that happened in my body and myself and my mind, when I finally realized I did have a need. And it started with me telling my godmother, I need you, Mom, right? I'm hoping that the Black women who read this book and the people who read this book will see that it is imperative that cracking happens when you have a chronic illness. None of us are able to be on this island alone. And so one of the best things I've ever done was to admit to people, especially my family, that I needed, because I've been supported in ways that I couldn't even have imagined had I not said anything at all. And I do want to say, Pato, I do also concur with what you said about the sexual. I had a low libido for the first 4 months of my illness, from March until August, I think. And then, and we don't talk about this enough, it's so important. And then I went into a hypersexual desire. It was, even though I was by myself, it was just like, oh my God, where is a person? Because I went from going like this to like, ooh, you know what I mean? And I said, I knew that was long COVID because it was so erratic. It made no sense. So I do want to say that I totally understand from that perspective. And I would love to have more conversations about that too, because we don't talk about that enough as well.
Yeah, I would too. And just our
Yeah.
need for touch, right? The libido for
Yeah.
sure, and pleasure and
Yeah.
orgasm and
Yeah.
our sexual well-being, but even
Mhm.
just, a caress and
Yeah.
to be held. You spoke really
Mhm.
beautifully about wanting to keep your godmother safe, right? And keep
Yeah.
a physical distance, but we all
Mhm.
still need the affection. And I think that's what's been powerful about when we share with each other and more publicly, when we have the ability or courage, because we kind of break some of that down.
So Karla, I had a question for you in particular. In the book, in your chapter, you talked about what we refer to as gaslighting, but you really unpacked what it really was. It was medical racism. And you had also talked about that you wish you had found community first to help guide you in this new health journey. And you specifically referred to the MECFS community. You wrote, I wish I had found them first. Your chapter was really eye-opening, hard to read. You really did a great job. I could see everything that was happening to you. And I wonder if you could just share a little bit about, what happened to you, because it was this kind of intersection of racism, sexism, fat phobia, like all these kind of things happening at once. If you could share a little bit about that how you really realized that that was happening. And if you could also just share, why is community important when somebody has a disability, and, what can social workers do to help connect people to community? And I know that's a lot. I asked you just to do 3 things: medical racism. How did you feel? How, what can social workers do? But
yeah,
can you give me your answer?
Yeah. It was really clear from the very beginning. I mean, the first time I went to get checked out, it was like, and they were like, oh, we're only testing people who have had contact with people in China or Italy, right? Like, even that being the first criteria is a classist criteria, right? And it was already known that community spread was happening, and the way they chose to share the limited test that they had was a classist measure, right? And a racist measure, because you're disproportionately going to get less Black, Native, like mixed race and or Latina people in that, right? And when I went to the hospital, there were a couple of things that I didn't actually write in the book, because after a while, it just felt like, if I write more, people are not going to believe this. But when I came down, like, I thought I was going to pass out. I had called the ambulance, and, had gotten myself with makeup because I was afraid that I wouldn't get taken seriously if I looked as sick as I was. And you're like trying to get this line between, I need to look presentable enough to not have people think I am a low income Latina, right? Like, legitimately the worst, like, self-hating feeling, right? But I need to look not so good that people stop taking me seriously, right? And it's like, it's like a dance on the head of a pin while as sick as you've been in your entire life. And I come downstairs, and I had a neighbor who is a Black woman who had been a major part of the AIDS community, like an HIV community at the time of its first outbreak. And I let her know I was going to the hospital, and she was like, I'm just going to stand outside when the ambulance comes to get you. And the ambulance came to get me, and the first thing that the paramedics do is take my blood pressure, and 3 times it comes back 75/52, and they're like, that can't be right, we've got to get the real blood pressure. And she screamed she was like, would you just get her in the fucking ambulance and make these calls on the way to the hospital? And then they put me in the ambulance, and the paramedics asked me, like, if I had been eating too much beans and rice and things, like, just like, do I know English? Like, just the worst. Like, and I was like, nope, that's not what's happening here. And, and when I am in the hospital, and the doctor immediately came ready to check me, and he's like, no, COVID doesn't last for this long. So you can't possibly be hospitalized for COVID, even though I'm having cycling oxygen levels from 90 to 70 and high tachycardia in like the 160 to 180 range. And so, my friends and family are fighting for me, and he's becoming more and more agitated as that happens. Like, the doctor was a person of color. So I say that because I think it's important our own people can perpetuate these stereotypes quite a bit, and particularly when we have been indoctrinated, right, within systems that say, like, oh, you were able to get through this medical degree because you're cleverer or smarter than everyone else. Like, there is a really, like, nefarious thing that like puts in the water for medical training that I've thought about quite a bit. And at one point in time, I was like, I know that clots are coming, have been coming out, given like what my stats are, can I get a CT? And they were like, no, because you may get breast cancer. And I was like, I know that a CT is a standard procedure for like a suspected clot. Like, can I get a D-dimer and a CT? And he's like, if you're going to do that, then you're going to have to say, I'm okay with getting cancer if I get this test. And literally not until I would say, I am fine getting cancer if I get this test, it was the moment when they would take me to get the CT, right? And so the whole thing was abusive, right? And you know, the fat phobia thing I think is incredibly important to address in that too, right? Because I'm a like mixed race but light-skinned Latina, and if I were thin, I think I probably would have gotten different treatment, but my body fits an archetype that is like more tagged to Blackness, right? And so like, I think that complexity, it like drives the racism that I experienced that someone maybe with my complexion might not have experienced, right? And I think it's really important to say, because a lot of Native presenting Latina people are being immediately dismissed as lazy, immediately dismissed as not telling the truth when they are in their appointments, right? Like as I said, I have been through at least 7 primary care providers because no one believed me, right? And it just, and when I had an HMO, the doctor is actively preventing you. An HMO to me is the most systemically racist, structurally racist thing that we have in this country, because it says that the one expert is the one that gets to say whether or not you are well or ill. And that it's horrific, you know? And when I said that I wish I would have gone to, met the ME CFS community first, I had so many doctors because of that fat phobia be like, you just gotta get moving, you know, like, you know, sometimes we like being in bed, it's too bad, you know, like I had the one, I say in the chapter, I had the one cardiologist that was like, you know, it's nice to be in bed, but sometimes we got to get moving, entiende? And it was a white cardiologist that said it to me, like entiende means understand in Spanish. And I feel like the thing that I know now about chronic illness is that like there is wisdom in community. And I think we have been so told over and over again that like essentially community can be quackery. Right. And like, that's just not to say that the quackery doesn't exist there. It's just, but there are lessons in community. And if I had done that first, I don't know where I would be now. I'm 3 years out and still experiencing this. And I think it's because I had a strand of doctors that told me I needed to get to exercising when all of this started, right? And so if I had come across that community first, I would have known to hold my ground and what my gut and my body were telling me. And, you know, I think it's important to say that I think the doctors a doctor's role in a post-internet life is a different role than it was beforehand. And they are having a very hard time grappling with that. And now patients, like medical journals that would have been inaccessible to us pre-internet are accessible to us now. And a lot of us are doing research and coming to the table to work with a partner to help create the context that plugs in the whole body together to figure out what's happening. And instead, doctors take that as like, don't WebMD me, like, you know, you're doing quackery yourself if you think that you can match my medical training. And like, that's a protection of power, right? And I believe that we have to be active in not just like our own advocacy for our disease, but to really be telling the medical community that their jobs have changed pretty tremendously and that there's a huge opportunity for them to be like the context creator for the information we bring in instead of adversarial with it.
Thank you, Karla. I just want to say that I think in your chapter, one of the things that just like, I don't want to give a violent imagery, but it just like hit me on the head was this question that you posed. So what do you do when the disease you have contracted presents as the various stereotypes people believe about your community? And I was like, oh my God, that is a dissertation topic. And I was just like, that's an amazing question. But in the meantime, we just have a couple of questions in the Q&A that I want to just throw out to everyone. And this is for anyone to answer. Do you have any advice for folks with long COVID whose employers won't provide accommodations, for example, permission to work remotely?
First of all, yes, I do. I document everything. I documented everything from the day that I knew that something was wrong and I didn't feel right in this body. I sent emails because I wanted to have documentation. I operate by a CYA mentality, and that's cover your ass. And so I made sure I kept all my medical documents together. I sent them to the school district so that they could have them. I also made sure that I showed them any updated Health and Human Services, CDC, documentation, the Department of Labor in the United States, any information about their definition of disability. And if you are someone who pays into a pension, or you are unionized, or you have access to somebody who's a representative of your industry, who represents you in your industry, I would suggest, please go talk to them, because if somebody is not respecting your medical diagnosis, or even you saying that you don't feel well enough to do the same duties that you did prior to illness, then that is something that you need to be talking to disability justice people about, employer disability justice, your union representative, if they are people who are committed to being on the side of the employee, not just the employer, because some people play both sides, right? But I would just, advise a person to keep all documentation, be very transparent, to reach out to disability justice and employee justice departments in your state or your city, and also connect with the union rep who is for you. And that's what I would say, because once you start that ball rolling, when they start seeing laws, which Biden and other people have actually in this country have said it is a disability that requires accommodations, people will run scared.
I'm aware we are at time, and I know that we didn't get to many of the questions in the chat, but I just want to say, first of all, thank you so much to all the panelists tonight. Thank you so much to the Columbia Graduate School of Social Work. Thank you, Dean Lowe, for hearing me when I came to you and said, this is so important. We need to provide this space. I am going to pitch this book. Please buy this book. Please share this book with loved ones, friends, family. There's a wealth of information in it. For social workers, we wear lots of hats. We're counselors, we're coaches, we're educators, we link people to service. I think one of the most beautiful things that we can do is listen to our clients and really provide the psychoeducation that they may need. And I think a good place to start is by getting this book so that you're prepared if you have clients with long COVID. And anyway, I apologize for going over. So I'll stop here to see if Dean Lowe has any closing comments before we end our time together.
I just wanted to send a huge thank you to our panelists. I mean, your vulnerability, sharing your personal narratives, the powerfulness of all of that you had to share tonight has been so appreciated, so welcomed in the chat box if you haven't been watching it. And I just want to say I personally appreciate you all doing this and sharing so much wisdom and experience. So thank you. And thank you all attendees for joining us tonight. We'll have the recording captioned and then it will be posted to the DEI website. And we'll send out a link to all the people who were here this evening.
Terry, can I flex something very quickly? I did try to answer questions with resources very, very quickly. There's a how to get on disability is the first link. The second link is EEOC, so employment guidance to how to do accommodations. The third link is sample letters to ask your employer for accommodations. And the fourth link is ME Action's guide to pacing, because somebody had a question about how to get people to believe you're pacing. So I know we got a roll, but depending on saving chat, there's some resources in the chat to try to help begin to address some of the questions we didn't get to. Thank you.
Saving the chat right now, and I'll put together sort of a resource sheet to send out to everyone. So thanks, Pato.
Thank you so much. And I hope everyone has a good evening. Please stay connected through ME Action, other great organizations out there to support folks who are living with long COVID. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.